Hello, my name is Mason Ballard. I'm doing my missional Helix project on multi-generational ministry. This topic is attractive to me because I'm a church planter in downtown Charleston, West Virginia, and I'm 22 now. When we started the church, I was 20, about to turn 21, I believe. It's been about a year and a half. So I'm pretty young, and so I've had to deal with a lot of um, issues between ages and how being young do I lead older people. And so I wanted to delve into this more. I think that church plant should be multi-generational. I think we are disproportionately young. So theological reflection, age in the context of the New Testament church. Titus 2, 1 through 8, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's a series of commands to older women and to younger women and to older men and to younger men. And some of the commands to older men are that they be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and steadfastness. And so the Apostle Paul is really calling on older men for their character to represent their age, for their wisdom to be evident. Um, Commands to older women to be reverent in their behavior. He says not slanderers or slaves to much wine. So don't talk bad about people and get drunk. Sounds like the Desperate Housewives wouldn't fit in well in the Christian church. Teach what is good, train younger women to love their husbands and children, be self-controlled, pure, work at home, be kind, submissive to your husbands. Why? So that the word of God may not be reviled, so that God may be glorified in your behavior. The commands to younger men are of particular interest. Um, Paul says to be self-controlled, model good works in your teaching, show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned. I think young leaders are under a lot more of a microscope. I think that young leaders have a shorter leash. We don't have the experience in a lot of ways. And so a lot of times things do hit us and we fall and fail. And the Apostle Paul is just saying, like, in those seasons, make sure that you're walking with integrity, dignity, and sound speech, that you cannot be condemned. So when controversy comes, when strife comes, these things that are inevitable, that I personally have just been walking through on just a really intimate level the last couple of months, that your enemies can't actually say anything about you that's true because you've shown integrity, dignity, and sound speech, and you've taught in such a way that is honoring to God. So I think that's an appropriation of age in the New Testament and in Paul's letters throughout his letters to Timothy, especially. He'll say things like, "Don't let people look down on you because of your youth." Been said, set an example, things like that. We see the age and the life and ministry of Jesus. How is age appropriated in the Gospels? Jesus was definitely more than a rabbi, but he was certainly not less than a rabbi, and he would have been about 30 years old. Another famous rabbi, Akiva, I think, was about 60 when he was in his prime, serving God, and in as much as he knew him. Um, and so Jesus' followers as well, the original disciples, were also young. I think different people have sort of different interpretations about how young. Peter was probably 20 because he had to pay the temple tax. Some people speculate that John could have been between 8 and 12 years old. Maybe he was the beloved disciple because he was by far the youngest. Um, Nonetheless, the disciples were most certainly young men. Cultural analysis. What does it mean to be old? What does it mean to be young? In the day and age we live in with modern healthcare and people growing older and older, 30 definitely isn't old. 40 isn't really even old. 50 really is not even old. I think when you start hitting the 60s, upper 60s, 70s, I think maybe people in the culture would consider you old. Um, but what are some stereotypes for these people in these different generations? You got four major generations today in the culture of the United States. You've got your traditionalists, born between 1925 and 45. Here's their stereotype. It would be conservative, rule-oriented, self-sacrificing patriots. And that last part is particularly true, and these people served our country well. And then coming after them are the baby boomers. Their stereotype is that they are a little more idealistic, driven in a good way, but also materialistic micromanagers, the most privileged generation that ever lived. You got the Gen Xers, cynical, self-sufficient, rule-bending skeptics. The Generation Yers, you got your millennials, We are apparently a fun-loving, narcissistic bunch. We're job hoppers, we're addicted to technology, and so on and such forth. Are these caricatures true, or do we tend to give a distorted picture of one another? I don't know. I think that some hold true, some certainly do not, and nothing is true in all cases. There was a scientific study. I don't know how scientific. I think they interviewed a few thousand people to kind of review some of these stereotypes and see what is true and what's not. Some things that were somewhat verified is that work is a little less central for younger people. Older people do tend to have a stronger work ethic, and younger people tend to value leisure and working at their own pace, not working a traditional 9 to 5 job. So kind of the orientation to work and jobs is different between generations. So generational tension within the culture is seen all over the place. It's seen especially in the workplace where all these generations who are still working, many couldn't afford retirement, and so they're still in offices. You got people born, in the 40s perhaps. They're going to phasing out obviously, but nonetheless, you've got older baby boomers working with millennials who are 18, 19, 20. And so there's definitely plenty of tension in office spaces. Generational tension within the church, and I guess culturally as well. You use the music, entertainment, all these places. It's very evident. Generational tension within the church. We grew up in the day of the worship wars. Thank the Lord that those are over and gone. But nonetheless, they happened. And I think there are some lingering effects of those worship wars. One would be the lasting category of contemporary and traditional, at least right now. Some churches have a contemporary service and a traditional service, and I think that oftentimes is a little too segregatory, if that's a word. And going back to that, though, generational tension within the church. I get to serve on the admin committee for our state convention here in West Virginia, and I'm like, a third of the age of the other guys. And so having conversations with them and our state meetings and things like that, you get to see a lot of those tensions. And I think that, in my opinion, these are the places I see them most clearly. Theological convictions. The younger folks tend to be more Calvinistic. They tend to talk about the kingdom more. The older folks tend to be a little more emphasis on your personal walk with Christ, which I think we can learn from in a lot of ways. But on the kind of flip side, the negative side of that is the gospel is much more individualistic, and the global implications aren't seen as much. Methodological preferences is another category where there's tension. I feel like oftentimes older folks will push for more programs within church life, and younger folks are wanting to start new works. Denominational affiliation. Younger folks are often less tied to the denomination. And then political involvement. Your older folks are more likely to be more conservative on issues like the refugee crisis, for instance, and immigration as a whole. Perhaps even healthcare, though a little less so. There can often be, and especially in a lot of the racial issues going on, the older people will tend to not think it's as big a deal, and the younger people will tend to think that there is systematic oppression and things like that. The younger folks will tend to value diversity more. So there's some tensions within the church. What are barriers to multi-generational ministry? I think some of these tensions are, but your average church members, they're not necessarily divided on those issues. I think the biggest barrier is just pride. It's just fear of man, and older people are afraid to approach younger people because older people don't think they're cool enough, and then younger people are afraid to approach older people because they just assume they're being judged or whatever. So I think the biggest barrier is just pride. Pastor Ortberg, in an article with Christianity Today, talks about how multi-generational ministry at the church-wide level is really a new concept that we are pioneering in our day, because this is the only time, he says, in American history that all these generations are forced to worship together. He likens it to trying to minister to people in France and Spain. He said you've got 4 different cultures in one gathering. What are some examples of effective multi-generational ministry where everyone comes together and we do life together? Ortberg points out that the people who have done it well are your smaller churches from the Amish or Mennonite traditions, because children are acculturated into the common life of the church much earlier, in early childhood even. If this hasn't happened by the time they're 12 or so, then kids are already shaped into who they are in their own generational microculture. So they probably never will have that barrier broken down between cultures. Historical perspective, there have certainly been effective young leaders in biblical history, and I want to make the case that they served older people well, that they didn't represent their demographics so much as they didn't focus on their will or their agenda, but focus on why God had called them to the place He had called them at that particular moment in time and space. Um, you've got David, the young hero. You've got Joshua and the generation under 20 there. You've got Josiah, the boy king who starts a revival. Jeremiah, the young prophet. Over and over, you see young leaders in the Old Testament. We've talked about some in the New Testament. Effective young leaders in church history. Spurgeon started when he was just a lad. Whitfield started when he was about 21. I've even read some articles and blogs that suggest that there has never been a true great revival that wasn't in some way affected and begun by young people. Great missionary movements have often been spearheaded by younger people. And I want to consider that there are ever-changing notions of traditional and contemporary. Today's contemporary is tomorrow's traditional. Um, yeah, I mean, Chris Tomlin will one day be as archaic as a church pew. And generational conflict is nothing new. Every generation thinks that they're misunderstood. Every generation tends to think their ideas are better. And we tend to frame our ideas in light that makes us sound smarter, more advanced, or whatever. Strategic plan. Where do we go from here? How can we be a church that is integrated? I believe that we are not called to be young churches. We're not called to be old churches, but we're called to be a community of faith. We're called to be a multi-generational family. Families have old people. Families have young people. Every family is different, and the same is true with our churches. They should all have young people. They should all have old people. Degrees of leadership may vary within that family or within that church, but they should be there. Missionally, I think you provide neutral space. An older guy doesn't want to walk into a hipster coffee shop. Walk into the garage with him. Watch a football game with him, what have you. Go to Bob Evans for young people. Leave your comfort zone a little bit. Get out of your context to build relationships with people of other generations. And I think that if you're doing a more attractional worship experience, then it should be multi-generational in its expression of worship. I found in our church that we would say we're not a young church, we're not an old church, we're a family, but everything we were doing was very geared towards 25-year-olds. And it was very white, and it just wasn't something that was attracting a diverse group of people. Noticed everyone on the stage was young. We needed to incorporate different elements. So I ordered 150 not pews, couldn't fit those in our room, 150 hymnals from Lifeway, and we'll be instituting those. Humility is crucial in the face of awkwardness. Initiate relationships. Try new things. Talk to someone who's outside of your age group. Now, be aware of your language. Sometimes we say things that older people just don't understand, like missional. It needs defined. Um, Church planting even needs defined. I think that sometimes we need to be more intentional with our language. Um, I want to just end with this vision of a healthy multi-generational church where the older people are raising the younger people, and that you don't even really have a youth group because just every older person in the church takes responsibility for raising the generation. It takes a church to raise the generation that is to come. And finally, I think that as church leaders, especially as church planters, we need to take tactical steps to begin doing things that foster a healthy relationship between generations. The church can take the lemons of generational tension and make just a lemonade of harmony. Stole that from a Desiring God article, which you can see in my handout. Um, but we can show that there is reconciliation at the cross of Christ. That following Jesus is not something for your grandmother. Following Jesus is not something for the hipster Instagram addict, but following Jesus is something for every man, woman, boy, and girl of all ages. But how do we implement these tactical steps? One, man, just don't do the big band and worship, man. Sing something old school. Don't call it old school, just do it. Or invite someone older up on the stage to share. If you're at an older, more traditional church, try something new, try something contemporary. Um, Tomorrow or this week sometime, reach out to someone who's older than you from a different generation, and let's see this vision of a healthy, multi-generational church come to pass. I think it's a beautiful picture of the gospel, and we have much to give and much to learn. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.